were fearless even in their silence, even in the denial of their God-given rights.
I am Mary Rawlinson. I would tell you my story. It was near the end of King Philip's War, 1675. We women were suffered to wait at the fort while some of our men went for help. So it was us mostly who were captured by the Indians when they attacked. We were made to march through the wilderness. My smallest child, my little girl, was wounded in the fight and soon died. My boy, an older girl, were kept from me, sent to be slaves to other Indian families. All that time of tramping around in the forest, going God knows where, to fight the militia, I was never molested. I thought to be. It surprised me also to see Indian women as leaders of some of their groups. And these women were married, no less. They were the chiefs, and the men deferred to them. I thought of how, once I was married, I was considered bonded to my husband and to have no identity of my own. The law treated me as if I were no more than one of his limbs. I no longer owned anything except the clothes I wore. Any money I made selling eggs or such belonged to him as well. Even our children were his property. Finally, after 11 weeks of nearly starving along with my captors, a gentleman from Concord met the Indians at Redemption Rock and gave them 20 pounds, my ransom. It was raised, he said, by the women of Boston. Good to see that some of us can do more than bake pies. Now I am back with my surviving children and my husband, one of his limbs again. I have been encouraged by all, except my husband, to write a book about my experiences. If he allows it, I will do this. Then I will be somebody.
Hello, my name is Sarah Ann Schrader. I was born on July 20th, 1839, to Joseph Steiner and Susanna Miller Steiner. I married Daniel Schrader in 1858. We lived on his family farm in western Pennsylvania until he was called to go to war in 1863. Daniel, his father, and 3 brothers all joined the Pennsylvania 11th Infantry Regiment. We had 2 children at the time, a 4-year-old named Ossian and a newborn named Margaret. Many of the soldiers' wives went with their husbands to serve as nurses or as civilian runners. It was the first war where women were actually allowed to be trained as nurses. All 3 of my sisters-in-law went with their husbands, but since I had a newborn to care for, I was left behind with my mother-in-law. It was our duty to tend to the farm and care for the nieces and nephews left behind when their parents went to war. Including my children, there were 12 children ranging in age from my newborn to 9 years old. Although the oldest ones tried to help around the farm, most of the work was left to the 2 of us. Before the war, I knew what was expected of me as a wife, mother, daughter-in-law, and what my role was in society. But the war changed all that overnight. My husband and I lived in a small house on the family farm, as did his 3 brothers and their families. We each had our own little house, but the farm work was shared by all. The men worked the land, cared for the animals, maintained the houses and the barns, and provided all the wood for cooking and heating. The women cared for the children, cooked, cleaned, canned the harvest, made the clothes, milked the cows, and collected the eggs. But once the men were gone, every aspect of farm life fell to my mother-in-law and I. The crops were in for the 1863 season when the men left, but we had to tend to them and harvest them in the fall. We were not prepared for the amount or the physicality of the work. We had been protected from hard labor and hot sun by the men in our lives, but now we had to do it all. We managed to bring in the harvest that fall, but a great portion went to feed the troops. We were left with barely enough to feed the family that winter. Eggs and milk kept us going. In the spring of 1864, we struggled to plant the crops and were somewhat successful. Our harvest that fall was only half of what the previous year's was, but we still sent what we could to the troops. In the spring of 1865 found us barely hanging on to the farm. Thankfully, the creditors were understanding and gave us more time to pay the debts. But we knew that if the war went on much longer, we would lose the farm. Luck was on our side, and my husband and his father returned in July of 1865. We had planted what we could that spring, excuse me, and my husband and his father were able to get some late summer crops in to help with the bills. Saving the farm became everyone's priority. After the war, life returned to normal, but for me, it would never be the same. I knew that I was capable of so many things that women were not permitted to do. And more importantly, my daughter, Asiane, who had observed what women could do, now knew that women were strong and could do anything. So we were forever changed. Even as I resumed the traditional duties of wife and mother, my daughters and I knew we were capable of doing so many things that we never would have tried before the war. We were different from the inside out. Daniel and I went on to have 5 more children, all boys. But I can understand the strength. I understand the strength that women possessed, the strength that came out when times were called for it. It was a strength that grew in all women during all wars and built up generation after generation. And since my daughters knew it too, I began to hope that one day women would be considered as equal to men. Could that ever happen?
Close to 30 years after the end of the Civil War, the National Association of Colored Women was organized in July of 1896. The organization's founders included some of the most renowned African-American women, educators, community leaders, and civil rights activists of the time, including Harriet Tubman, Frances E.W. Harper, Margaret Murray Washington, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Mary Church Terrell, who became the organizer's first president. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified, granting women the right to vote. It is important to recognize that despite great progress in women's rights for women of the time, for that time in history, Black women were still marginalized from voting until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed.
My name is Baidzar Karaohlanyan, and I just arrived in New York City 2 months ago from the Armenian district of Cairo, Egypt. This is a new year, 1921, and my husband Vartan and I recently married. Vartan, who went to university to be electrical engineer, is a naturalized American citizen. And because I am his wife, I automatically a citizen too. I also getting better at speaking English. I practice very much. I am very excited because women in the United States of America finally win the right to vote. Less than 1 year ago. So I have the right to vote. Women in my old country, even Christian women, must always cover their heads in public. But here in America, I can wear a hat or not, and I can vote for our next president. Vartan travels on the train along the Hudson River to the Maxwell Briscoe Automobile Manufacturing Company of Tarrytown, New York. He leaves very early in the morning and do not return until evening. He makes a good salary that pays for a lovely home in Upper Manhattan apartment building. There is dry goods store on the next block next to butcher and bakery. It is very convenient to have only a short walk to the shops. The Iceman, he come often, so I keep icebox full. And church is only 3 blocks away. I get lonely for old country sometimes, but we have very good life here in America. Most of my friends are Armenian. I know them from church. Many of them escaped from the massacres of the Armenians by the Turks. That is why Vartan and I leave Constantinople to live in Cairo. I am a little afraid of talking with my American neighbors, but I am trying. First, this gives me something to do while Vartan is work all day and I finish housework and cooking. It also gives me a chance to practice my English. One friend who lived next door, Viola, she worked in a printing factory during the Great War, but she released as soon as the men start to return from Europe. I know the men come back from war expecting their same jobs again, but it is not fair to Viola, who worked there for 3 years. My friend Alma, who lived on the floor below, also worked during the war at a clothing factory. Her husband had injury at Ypres and sent home, and Alma soon became pregnant. But the factory fired her a full year before the Great War ends, just because she was to have a baby. I know she wanted to continue work even after she gave birth, because her mother lived with them and she watches the little one. Alma's husband speak to attorney friend of his about, was this legal? They learn that it was legal and was done all the time. I do not think that is fair. Not that I am interested in a job. I play piano and violin, I sing and paint, but work in a factory do not interest me. And soon I want to have a baby. I pray that my daughters, if I have them, grow up with more choices.
The 1940s opened up opportunities for women. Because of the war effort, the government established the Women Accepted Volunteers for Emergency Services, WAVES, and the Women's Army Corps, WAC. Legislation was also passed to allow women to join the Navy. Although women in the workforce increased to about 35% during this time, they were not paid the same as their male counterparts. African Americans, women, were also prosperous during the 1940s.
Hi, I'm Ruthie from Bayonne, New Jersey. Yeah, when I graduated Bayonne High School in 1942, we were in the middle of World War II. You know, there was no choice. Us women, we were expected to go to work in the war-related factories. My mother is slightly handicapped, so she's home. She gets $28 a month. That's her allotment check from my brother who's in the Navy. And my younger brother, well, he's still in high school. Big deal, he has a paper route. So it's me. I'm the one supporting the family. So I had to go to work full-time in the factory. Forget any idea about college. You know that poster that was with Rosie the Riveter? Well, I'm Ruthie the inspector. My job in the factory where we build these little motors, those motors raise and lower the flaps on B-17 bombers. They're called flying fortresses. You know why? They have 13 machine guns, 10 other guns. They carry 6 tons of bombs and a crew of 10 men. If those flaps don't go up and down on takeoff or landing because the motor doesn't work, that whole plane, all those bombs and men just go up in a huge explosion. I hold the lives of those men and that machinery in my hands. And with all of that responsibility, you know what I found out? Joe, the older guy who has the exact same job, he's another inspector. He's getting 30 cents an hour more than me. So I complained to the bosses. They said, it's our right to pay you whatever we want. Go tell it to the National War Board. Okay, so I took a day off and 2 buses, and I went to Newark and talked to that National War Labor Board. And I said, didn't the government pass a law making equal pay for equal work for women? And they said, sorry, Ruthie, your government only passed a resolution, not a law. They made it whatever the bosses wanted. It was a recommendation. And there are 310,000 women right now working in war-related factories. And all of you ladies are getting 70 cents on the dollar. And down south, 50 cents on the dollar. So stop whining. Go back to work. It's your patriotic duty. And anyway, soon as this war's over, the men are going to come back, take over those jobs, and you'll be back in the kitchen where you belong. Ladies, I've heard your stories. I know what I'm going through. Will it ever change?
In spite of the progress that has been made to benefit women and women's rights, the fight for equality still goes on to this time. In New Jersey, on May 2nd of this year, 2016, Governor Chris Christie vetoed a bill barring gender-based pay discrimination, saying it would go beyond federal standards and make New Jersey very business unfriendly. In 2014, it was reported that women working full-time in the United States were paid 79% of what men are paid. The gap has narrowed since the 1970s, but it's barely moved in a decade, and at the current rate, the gap won't close for 100 years. Here's some facts. Women face a pay gap in nearly every occupation. The pay gap is worse for women of color. Women and their families represent the fastest growing group of homeless population nationally, especially single African American mothers. Women are most likely to be victims of sexual assaults in the military, domestic violence with firearms. We as women and those concerned about women have an ability to insist on changes in policy that will encourage the economic and physical safety for all women. I'll leave you with this. Let us be moved to action by the words of William Wilberforce, a leader of the movement to abolish the slave trade. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say you did not know. As we reflect on what our personal responsibilities may be to these actions, let's consider Maya Angelou's words. I did then what I knew how to do. Now I know better, I do better. Amen.